Okay. So today is another Focus Sunday. So we have 6 of them throughout the year. This one today is really the first of the Focus Sundays because it starts with the birth of Christ and moves on from here. So even though it's still part of 2023, it's really the beginning of all of our Focus Sundays. The other bulk of them come in the spring, which is to me an interesting fact because we're in the fall, heading into the winter months where it's dark and dreary, dark and dreary, and then Christ comes, he's born, and we remember that, and then we move into the Good Friday and Resurrection Sunday, and then the coming of the Spirit to bring us the new covenant, and then all of a sudden everything's bright and cheery, and now we're heading into June, where we have the longest day of the month. I don't want to say too much about that or I'll ruin what my talk is tonight. But I found that really interesting, that how even our months of the year connect to everything that's in the scriptures. Well, being our Focus Sunday on the Incarnation, we want to focus in on the birth of Christ. How many of you know that the Bible is an amazing book? Right? It really is, isn't it? It's a supernatural book. It's God's revelation from Himself about Himself. Now, the Bible, of course, contains 66 books, as we have it in our hands today, written by at least 40 different authors in 3 different languages, written on 3 different continents, and all written only over a period of 1,500 years. So it's not a lot of years, but I mean, from our perspective, 1,500, I'd love to live 1,500 years, I think. But maybe not. Okay, but the thing is that the book is a single message. And in spite of all of those odds, it has the real life stories of hundreds of people of varying circumstances. There's prose, poetry, prophecy, miracles and wonders. There's wars with victory. There's wars with defeat. There are failures. There's successes. There's kings and paupers, dinosaurs and dragons, whirlwinds and multi-wheeled chariots, and beasts with 4 heads and other beasts with 7 heads. It's an amazing book. The Bible in many ways is complex, yet it's simple at the same time. And of course, we know that it's a book about Jesus Christ. It's a book about why He had to come, how He got here, and when He came here, what He did, and where He is now, and what happens next. So it's a book of redemptive history. And our history, the history of mankind, flows into the plan, the sovereign plan of God Himself to redeem His creation. Someone once said that the Old Testament is about someone is coming, that the Gospel is about somebody has arrived, and the rest of the New Testament is about someone is coming back again. And it's true when you focus in on Jesus being the center of the Bible. The Bible is all about Christ. And that's important to know. There's a lot of Christians today who get that really confused. They don't have the proper focus in the Old Testament. And they miss out on a lot of the supernatural direction from the Old into the New and how it all connects together. Well, the birth of Jesus, of course, then becomes the climax of the Old Testament, and it's the springboard into the New Testament. You have to have it in order to fulfill the Old, but you also have to have it in order to create what's coming in the New. And there is the sin of the Old, and the being in the realm of sin as our master, and the need of an exodus. And Christ brings that about when He comes. And so it's the gospel of Jesus Christ. Everything in the Old is driven forward in anticipation of the birth of a man. Of course, in the Old, they don't know that it's Jesus Christ. They only know that there's somebody coming. God first announced it to Adam that the seed of the woman would come and would deal with the serpent who deceived man, and deal with the sin and the death and destruction that came into the world, and fix up all of creation. So there's the seed of the woman. Later on, God announced to Abraham that he would be from the seed of Abraham. And then later from the tribe of Judah, and then the seed of David. And in the midst of all of that, he announced that he's going to be a greater Moses. So if you Jews think that Moses was great, a great man, the great deliverer who brought in the Exodus from Egypt, well, he's going to be a greater than even Moses. And his Exodus will be an Exodus from sin, which is a better thing to be saved from. And then later on he says he's going to be an Elijah come back. And like Elijah. Won't be Elijah himself. It won't be Elijah himself, but he'll be like Elijah. And then the Old Testament ends by saying he's going to be the warrior from God who goes to battle for us and wins the battle on our behalf. Okay, so throughout the whole Old Testament, people are told that they need to look for the Anointed One. Okay, the word Christ or the word Messiah means the Anointed One. And Psalm 2 is where it's first mentioned. That God's anointed, God's Son, will be the one who would come and fight the battles and win the battles, and all who come to him will be blessed in him. And that, of course, is the great promise to Abraham, that all of the world, all of the Gentiles, the whole world would be blessed because of the seed of Abraham, the son that comes, that is born to him. So everything in the old is pushing forward and advancing along to the birth of this one who they know as the Anointed One, who will deliver them from their sins. And it's for this reason that genealogies are very important in the Scriptures. How many of you like to read the genealogies when you're doing your reading the Bible through in the year? You get to the genealogy and you go, I could probably skip this part. It's just a bunch of names anyway, right? Isn't that what we do? Of course we do. But you know, they're in the Bible for a specific reason, for a very important reason. And the reason they're important is because the genealogies are not so much going backwards to see who our ancestors were, but they are going back to move forward. So that you follow each name and you're moving forward, and the genealogy drives us into the future. Because it's all about this coming anointed Son of God who's going to deliver the world. The purpose of the genealogy is to drive the story forward, to advance redemptive history until it reaches its conclusion. And the placement of biblical genealogies is really important. Genealogies, of course, they verify the fulfillment of promises. So we have the promise of the seed of the woman. And when we get into the New Testament, we read Matthew's genealogy, we realize this is Jesus. He fulfilled it. And the promise given to Abraham and to David is fulfilled in Jesus. And we know it because the genealogy helps to verify that. He has to be traced in order to be identified as the true seed of all of these promises that God has given. So when we come to the New Testament then, it begins then with a genealogy in Matthew chapter 1. So take your Bibles and open to Matthew chapter 1, and that's what we're going to look at today. So we've been doing these Focus Sundays for a number of years, and I tell you, it's getting harder and harder to find something new. Of course, we don't do that, do we? You don't try to find something new, but we want to help us to focus in on different parts. So today I want us to focus in on the genealogy in Matthew chapter 1. So the book of Matthew was written around AD 65. So Jesus died in AD 30, and he rose from the dead and then was ascended all in 40 days later. Came the Holy Spirit, and then the ministry of the disciples, the apostles, in advancing the gospel, first in Jerusalem, then to Judea, then Samaria, and out to all of the provinces of the country of Rome. And so it was expanding. And all of this is the New Testament. Well, 65 is when the book of Matthew was finally put together in terms of writing, and it was written by Matthew. This is 1 year after Nero set the city of Rome on fire. Of course, he blamed it on the Christians. So it was written to Jewish people to highlight Jesus as the promised Christ, the Messiah. And he begins with his birth and he ends with his ascension. Even though it's the Great Commission, it's right at that time he gave the Great Commission just before he ascended into heaven. And Matthew hopes to convince unbelieving Jews to make a decision about Jesus, to believe in him, and then that believing Jews would be convinced of their decision that Jesus is the Christ and that they should follow him and worship him. So verse 1 begins with the summary now of the entire story of the Old Testament. I mean, look at verse 1. It says, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So he's moving sort of way back and then comes forward and then back again. So when he says the book of the genealogy, this is an interesting phrase. In the Greek, it really is transliterated as the book of Genesis. And if we were to translate that word, the Greek word is genesis or Genesis. And if we were to translate it, we can translate it with the word genealogy, which is how it's done here. So the book of the genealogy. Which is kind of fitting, because what does he do right after this? He begins to name all of the ancestors, beginning at Abraham, all the way down to David, and then from David down to Joseph, who then is the father of Jesus. So that's a good way to translate it. But the phrase, and this phrase, well, back up a little bit here. So we have the genealogy, so it's kind of going back to Abraham, but then he says the son of David. So the last covenant that was given, the promise of was that he would be the son of David. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, and then going back to Genesis 12, where God said that he would be the son of Abraham. And so Matthew is declaring to these Jewish people that Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of these promises that God had made in the future. That he is the one that the whole Old Testament has been moving towards and planning and waiting for to come. Now this phrase, again, the book of genealogy, the book of Genesis, or the book, also occurs in one other place in the Bible. It occurs in Genesis chapter 5, verse 1. So Genesis chapters 1 and 2, of course, is the creation and then the retelling of the creation story. Genesis 3 is the fall of Adam and Eve into sin. And God says, in the day that you eat of this fruit, you will die, physical death. And physical death came upon mankind, and sin became prevalent among God's creation. And the curse of creation came into effect. And then in chapter 4, we are told that Adam and Eve have children, Cain and Abel, and then something bad happens to Abel, and then now so it begins again. So in chapter 5, it starts off by saying, this is the book of the generations. And again, the Hebrew word there is the same word that is translated in Greek, the genealogy or the Genesis. So it is saying, this is the book of the generations. This is the book of the genealogy. And it can be of Adam, meaning Adam, the first man, or it can be of mankind himself, because the Hebrew word Adam can be translated, can refer to either. In this place, it doesn't matter which one you do, because in the next few verses, he begins by saying Adam. And Adam lived this many years, and he begat so-and-so, and who lived so many years, who begat so-and-so, and so forth, and down the line. So we have a genealogy right there at the beginning of the Bible. The beginning of the Old Testament, and then one at the beginning of the New Testament. So again, driving it all along. The word Genesis, though, can also be translated not only genealogy, but it can be translated birth or existence, or even implying new life or a new existence. It could be translated the book of new birth, or the book of new beginnings, or the book of new life. So you see on the screen under Incarnation, I've got new existence, new birth, new life. So this is the Genesis, right? Nothing existed before the book of Genesis when God created and he made everything come to life. It was a new existence. It was a new birth. It was a new life. But then it was marred with sin. And so something new had to come again. So the whole storyline is moving forward. It's moving forward through generations of people, through genealogies. And throughout the Old Testament, you have every once in a while a genealogy after genealogy till you get the last book. And I'll come back to that. And there's another big one. And then the first book of the New Testament in Matthew's genealogy. So here it's announcing again a new book, a new existence, a new birth, a new life that has come. And that's probably a more fitting translation. Not that either one is right or wrong. It's just more fitting. The first one just refers to the fact that it is a list of names. It's a genealogy. And this one here, the new birth or new beginnings, focuses in then on the whole message of what Jesus is doing, what he came to do. He came to bring new life. He came to give new birth and new beginnings, and so that we might all have life. Now, not too many know that the Old Testament begins and ends with a genealogy, and the last genealogy, of course, runs into the New Testament genealogy to weld them together. So if you're looking for something that would be kind of an event that connects the old with the new, the genealogies is one of those things. It's not the only thing, but it is one of those things. And it's one of those things, again, that we always forget about because it's boring to read, isn't it? Okay, now, do you remember, according to not our English order of the Old Testament, but the Hebrew order of the Old Testament, which is called the Tanakh, okay, what is the last book in the Old Testament? It's in the English Bible, everybody knows. What's the last book in the English Bible? Malachi, okay? Okay, but what is the last book in the Hebrew order?
Second Chronicles.
Second Chronicles, yes, exactly. Okay, now in the Hebrew Bible, there is no First Chronicles and Second Chronicles. It's actually all one book, so it's just Chronicles. So First Chronicles chapter 1, for the whole first 9 chapters is a genealogy, starting with Adam, and it goes to Abraham, then to David, and then to the kings from Solomon, who lead the nation into the Babylonian captivity. The kingship is gone, and then he names a couple of those who would still follow in the line of David, and gives a genealogy of some of the people that return after the 70 years of captivity in Babylon. And that's where he ends. That's where the Old Testament chronology ends. And then the writer of Chronicles, from there he says, well, let's re-examine the whole life of David and the kingship or the dynasty of David. And he goes through that history again. And as you're going through it, you get this kind of a despair comes over you, and you realize that while the nation was great leading up to David, but from David on, it just began to deteriorate and get worse and worse and worse until, of course, God brings his judgment on them, and they're taken into exile to Babylon. And then he also says, well, let's talk about the temple, because David, of course, he wanted to build a temple. He says, it's not right that I should have a big castle, and God doesn't have any place to be. And so he says, I'm going to build a temple. And God says, no, your son is going to build a temple. Of course, that was a prophetic one. Not only did Solomon build the temple physically and literally, but Jesus, the son that the prophecy was really about, is the temple when he comes. But Chronicles is talking about the building of the temple and how great Solomon's temple is, and the glory of Solomon's temple being great in this world. And then, of course, the Babylonians come, the temple is destroyed, the walls of the city are destroyed, Jerusalem is laid to waste, and for 70 years the whole country lays dormant. Finally, the return when Cyrus becomes the head, who conquers Babylon, and the Jewish people are allowed to return. Well, they decide they're going to start to rebuild the walls and rebuild a new temple. And in the day of the dedication, Hosea tells us on the day of the dedication of this new temple, they're standing there, and the younger kids are saying, wow, this is great, we have a temple here. And the older ones who knew Solomon's temple, they're crying, going, this is nothing. This is sad. It's not the glory at all. This cannot be the temple that God wants us to have. And that's exactly where Chronicles ends the Old Testament. And then the genealogy of David comes in behind it. Now, so when you see the size of the genealogy of Chronicles, which is 9 chapters long, you know that there's something major is going to happen, because that's what genealogies do. Every time that they're placed in the scriptures somewhere, there's something big is coming up afterwards. It's not just a genealogy that's a few verses. This one's a few chapters long, and something really big is coming right after. But what it also does is it starts us on the track of looking at a great event in redemptive history that's about to happen. It introduces a whole new phase in redemptive history. And then everything that comes after Chronicles rehearses those major points of history, preparing us for the new. So when you compare the two genealogies of Chronicles, Chronicles, it goes back in time, as I said, and it goes back to Adam, then Abraham, then David, and then the last kings to the Babylonian captivity, and then some of the ones who return afterwards. But then it ends. And there's about 300 years or so from the end of the genealogies of Chronicles before we have the Jesus comes on the scene. And the book of Matthew then picks up the genealogy, and when you compare the two, it's kind of interesting to see. There are some things. Matthew's genealogy is not a complete one. He's done it in a style for a specific reason, but I'm not going to go into that this morning. Okay, but he picks it up from Abraham to David, and this is virtually the same as Chronicles, from Abraham to David. And then he goes from David down to Jehoiakim. In the New Testament, it says Jeconiah. Jeconiah is also Jehoiachin in the Old Testament, who is the last king when Babylon comes and conquers Judah. He's the king at the time. And so it's the end. So Jehoiachin marks the end of the Davidic dynasty. And so Matthew picks this up, and both of them come there. Then, of course, the Chronicles just gives us a small list of those who returned after the Babylonian captivity. Matthew doesn't mention those ones at all. Matthew doesn't pick it up till pretty much, it's hard to tell when, but a rough estimate in this, and don't take this as being gospel truth, but the number of names then in the last part of Matthew's genealogy probably start around the time that Julius Caesar and the Romans take control. So it's after the Maccabees, but it's nearing the end of that 400-year gap between the Malachi and Matthew, the birth of Christ. So Matthew picks it up, and he starts to name these unknown people, and in naming this and connecting it now to the Chronicles genealogy, he's making this connection that, hey, where there was this 400-year gap, and there seems to be a lost hope, and everything is in despair. He says, no, it's starting up again. It's coming. The fulfillment of Christ, of God's faithfulness to his promises is coming to us. So Matthew starts that, and of course he ends. It doesn't end until we reach Joseph in verse 16, where it says, "And Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born," and he adds, "who is called the Christ." So isn't that interesting there as well? Because he's saying, who is called the Anointed One. This is the one they've been waiting for. Every genealogy in the Old Testament was driving forward to reach this one that God promised them, the Anointed One. And they get near the end, and they've gone into exile. They come back, and they can't rebuild. They're still under foreign rule and control, and everything is in despair. And it looks like it's not going to happen. And then God is silent for 400 years. And then all of a sudden, the genealogy comes alive again. And they're able to put it back together and connect it and see, yes, in fact, that the Christ is here. And Matthew declares who is the Christ. So there is hope. The lifeline is intact. So Chronicles, as the last book of the Bible, draws the whole Old Testament together, and Matthew, the first book of the New Testament, pulls the Old into the New. Now, I just want to take a little side thing just to remind you of, remember when we did a study back in 2016, the summer of 2016, on biblical theology. How many took that course with me? Okay. All right, so what we were doing is we were looking again at the structure of the Bible. So here we have the Bible. Now, what I want you to see again is how the Old Testament all is culminating in the birth of Christ through the genealogy. So we talk about seams. So the different seams that connect us. So as we open the Bible up, we discover that the Bible is made up of three parts. Okay, there's the law, so the books of Genesis to Deuteronomy. There's the prophets, and the prophets actually end with Malachi. It starts with Joshua, ends with Malachi. And then the writings that start with Psalms and end with Chronicles. Okay, and this is I'm not going to go into the details of that structure because we did that in the course. But what I want you to see, to remind you of, is the connections between it. So when you come to the books of the law, it begins in Exodus with the people in Egypt, and they're slaves in Egypt, and they're crying out to God for a deliverer. And then we have the birth of Moses. And then we have the life of Moses and everything he does. And then we come to the book of Deuteronomy, Moses dies. We have the same thing in the Gospels. So mankind is in sin. And we're crying to God for deliverance from sin. And Jesus is born. And he's the great deliverer. And then we have in the Gospels his life. And the Gospels end with his death and resurrection. So in the Gospel, in Deuteronomy chapter, it's either 13 or 18, it escapes my mind right now, Moses said, you need to look for a greater prophet than I am. And the thing is, they're not looking for the prophet, but they're looking for a greater deliverer. So you have this anticipation at the end of Deuteronomy, as Joshua leads them into the promised land, they have the anticipation of a new deliverer who is going to deliver them from their sins, which means a new Exodus, you see. And this new deliverer, he's going to bring in a new covenant. And then when we come to the books of the prophets, we have Joshua, they're going into the promised land. And then we have the history in the land. By the time we get to the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, they're telling them, look at the way you lived in this land. You broke God's laws. God's going to take you out of the land. And then, of course, the books of the 12 lead all the way to that. And then Malachi comes along and he says, look, it's It's doomsday. All the prophets are saying you're going to be destroyed. You're going to end up in exile. God's taking it all away from you. And there is a picture of destruction and lack of hope. And then Malachi comes along and he says, but there is a forerunner who is coming. There is a new prophet who's coming. The one who is like Elijah. And interesting with Elijah is that he was the first of the Old Testament prophets. And what a prophet does is a prophet speaks for God. So everywhere you read Elijah and the other prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah, they're constantly saying, thus says the Lord, right? When Jesus comes on the scene, he never says that. He says, truly, truly, I say to you. See, Jesus is not only a prophet, but he's God, Emmanuel, God himself. And this, of course, is what Matthew says when the angel came to Joseph. He said, you're going to give him the name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. He's the deliverer. But he says he is also Emmanuel, God with us. He's the great prophet. He's the one you've been looking for. So that's at the end of the prophets. So a greater Elijah and a prophet who brings in a new message. And what's the new message? It's the gospel. It's that we can be saved through grace by faith in Jesus Christ. And this is then the other section, the last section of the Old Testament, the writings, begins with the book of Psalms. What does Psalms do? Psalm 1, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, right, but takes his delight in the law of the Lord. Okay, we always think that that's talking about us, but it's not. It's talking about the man that is to come. The man who doesn't sin. He never sins, but his delight is in God. And he's the one who will deliver us. That's what Psalm 1 is all about. And it creates this anticipation at the beginning of the Psalms to look for this man. And then Psalm 2 comes along and says you have all of these, the nations have all gathered together and they're angry at God and they're saying we're going to take over all of creation. And God says, no, I'm going to send my anointed one. And he says, my anointed one is my son, and he will crush all of the heads of his enemies. This is Psalm 2. And so you have this driving forward of anticipation of the plan of redemption through Psalms. And by the time you get to the last 10 or so Psalms, the great Hallel, the great Hallelujah, it's all about how the king, how God has won victory over all of the enemies in the book of Psalms. That's how it begins. And then we go into Lamentations, where we are to lament the fact that the temple is destroyed and the dynasty of David is gone, and there's no future. There's nothing ahead of us except to believe in God. And then the next book is Daniel. What does Daniel do? Daniel says, hey, there's coming these 4 kingdoms, and by the time of this 4th kingdom, the anointed one will come, and he is going to be like a small stone that crushes all the kingdoms of the earth. He's going to grow the kingdom of God, and we're all going to be part. We're going to become members of the kingdom of God. And then we're in the writings. Then Chronicles is the next book. The genealogy. Let's review the whole history. Go back to Adam. Follow through. Drive it through. Watch the plan of redemption through all of these people. And it ends here. The people returned. But this is not the exile that God's talking about. This is not the temple that God is talking about. This is not the dynasty that God has promised. It's not the greater Moses. It's not the greater Elijah. It's not the greater David who will become the warrior. In fact, the last words of the book of Chronicles is, now I think in our English Bibles it says